The M1 MacBook Air is extremely fast. It handles everything I throw at it and it lasts all day. So does the M2, but for an extra £250, is it worth it? The short answer is no. Stick around and I'll unbox the M2 MacBook Air and then I'll show you the differences between that and the M1 MacBook Air. This is a lot lighter than I was expecting it to be. This is great. Let's cover what's new, and the first thing you're going to notice is the new design. The M2 MacBook Air has the new squared off design, just like the M1 Pros and the M1 Max models. Because of that, it's nice and thick all across, whereas with the M1 MacBook Air, it was in a wedge shape, where it's thicker towards the back and thinner towards the front. The M2 MacBook Air, of course, comes in new colors, so you might be a fan of the midnight blue, which unfortunately I couldn't get my hands on, they were sold out. This one is a space gray, so it's the exact same color as last year's M1. Now, the weight and size of the M2 and M1 MacBook Air are very, very similar. Once I took this out of the box, I was so surprised at how light it was. It looks like it should be much heavier than it is because it's very premium looking. I was pleasantly surprised at how light it was, in the same way I was with the M1 MacBook Air. In terms of battery life, both of these last for up to 18 hours a day. If you haven't used Apple Silicon before, you're going to be blown away with just how long these laptops can last. Yes, the M2 has a faster processor, but it compensates for it in whatever way that it does. Even if there are small differences in the battery life, I don't think it really matters because they both last all day on a single charge, and that's what's important to us. Moving on to the display. The M2 MacBook Air has a slightly larger 13.6-inch display with a notch at the top. It also has 500 nits of brightness versus 400 nits on the M1 MacBook Air. That said, yes, the M2 MacBook Air is slightly brighter, but both of these laptops can be used outside without any issues. The refresh rate and the P3 color profile are exactly the same across both laptops, so there aren't any significant differences here in the display. In terms of performance, the M2 chip is fast. It is faster than the M1 chip, but it's a little bit slower than the M1 Pro. The thing is, I couldn't notice the difference using the M2 chip versus the M1 chip because the M1 chip could handle everything I was throwing at it, including Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Lightroom, Final Cut Pro. Those are pretty CPU intensive applications, and for most people, they won't be using those applications. They'll just be using their laptops to browse the web or do Zoom calls, listen to music, watch Netflix. So yes, you get slightly more power from the M2, but are you gonna notice the difference? They're both blazingly quick, and I don't think this should be a significant factor in your decision to choose between the two laptops. Here's some food for thought. Over here I have the M1 MacBook Pro. The MacBook Pros come with an internal fan to cool the system if it gets slightly too hot. In using the M1 MacBook Pro, I have never been in a situation where those fans have come on. Because of that, the MacBook Air actually holds up against the MacBook Pro because in most situations, the MacBook Pro isn't using that internal fan to keep the system cooled. The M2 MacBook Air, of course, comes with MagSafe, and MagSafe is a pretty cool new feature. It came from the old MacBooks of the past. You just get the cable and you'd slide it into place and it just magnetically click. And if you accidentally stepped on that cable, it would just disconnect automatically. Whereas with a USB-C cable, you might not have as much luck with it coming out all in one piece. The M2 MacBook Air comes with one MagSafe port and two USB-C ports, whereas the M1 MacBook Air comes with just two USB-C ports. I consider this not a big deal, but a nice to have, where you can have the MagSafe plugged in and have two ports free. However, how often do you have like 2 or 3 devices connected to the laptop at any given time? I mean, I do sometimes, and it can be annoying, but it's a very small problem. Next up, let's talk about the camera in the M2 MacBook Air. Apple have bumped up the camera inside to a 1080p webcam versus the 720p webcam inside the M1 MacBook Air. It is extremely clear and it looks really, really crisp and good lighting. So for Zoom calls, it's a really nice to have, but I don't think it's a game changer because the 720p is still good enough, and after all, your face is like this small on a Zoom call. It's not really that big. The 1080p camera doesn't actually create any more depth of field than the 720p, so it's not really like a big enough bump, but it is a nice to have, and it is on the M2 MacBook Airs, so I thought I'd mention it. One of my favorite things about using these MacBooks is the keyboard. The Magic Keyboard uses something called a butterfly movement, and this is an upgraded, renewed, redesigned movement versus the scissor movement, which came in the Intel MacBooks once upon a time, and they were riddled with all kinds of problems. So the benefit of using these keyboards is that they're very tactile and very clicky and very satisfying to use. The main difference in keyboard between the M2 and the M1 MacBook Airs is that the M2 comes with a full height function key row, whereas the M1 comes with like a half height function key row. Again, I think this is a minor difference. It's not game changing. My take is, For the next couple of years, the M1 MacBook Air is an absolute steal. It is a future-proofed option with Apple Silicon inside, and it won't leave you disappointed because it's just so fast and it lasts all day. It's amazing to think that almost everyone can have access to a device that can help them launch an online business or create a new design. It doesn't matter if you're a billionaire or if you're a student, everyone pretty much uses a MacBook to do their work. And it's fantastic to see that the playing field is somewhat level from a technology point of view. I would highly recommend you buy a used M1 MacBook Air if you haven't purchased one already. And the reason being is because you can get some crazy good deals on them. I've seen mint condition M1 MacBook Airs sell for about £600 on eBay, which is incredible. It really puts the price tag of the M2 into perspective. £1,250 versus £600, and you get a laptop that's like 99% as good. If you enjoyed this video, you should check out my channel. I cover all kinds of Apple tech. Thank you very much for watching.